Good morning, church. Happy Sunday. I hope you're having a great weekend so far, and I want to welcome you to our PCC service, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're watching on Periscope, Facebook, Twitter. It's just really good to have you with us this week. I just love this time of this time when I get to share what God has laid in my heart. As I've been thinking about you and thinking about what to share with you, what I've received from God. And today, I want to talk about something that is really talked a lot about in the movies. It's talked a lot in conspiracy theories, but it's hardly something that's really discussed in church. And when I was growing up, this topic was talked about all the times in church, um, but nowadays not too much. And it's a topic of end times. And the reason why it's because it can be a little bit confusing, so people just don't like really touch it. But today, what I want to do is that I want to address and provide answers to questions that you may have, like is this world as we know it, is it perpetual? Does it go on forever, or is there really an end to this world? And what is this? People talk about the number 666. You see it in all these like Omen movies and stuff like that. Like what is that all about anyway? So we're gonna kind of talk about that. Why people are scared of the number, and we're gonna just pretty much talk about like really what happens in the end. Before we get started, I just want to just pray, commit this time. Heavenly Father, I pray that you'll just speak to me, Lord. This topic can be a little bit heavy, Lord, but I pray that you'll just make it clear as I deliver what is it that you've asked me to speak about. In Jesus' name, amen. Recently, I got into a conversation. I don't know why I do this, but I get in conversations occasionally with people on Facebook, and I ended up a conversation in Facebook Messenger with someone who was telling me that I should tell everybody in the church not to vote for a particular political party. And so, I like play along like, well, why not? He says, because that party's platform supports policies that is going to usher in the Antichrist, and it's going to usher in this new world order, and it's going to usher in everybody's going to have to take the mark, all because if you vote for this political party. And as I kind of read what he was speaking on, and we discussed it, it became really clear to me that there's just a whole lot of confusion about what happens in the end. Just tons of confusion. For the past 5 weeks, we've been discussing and doing a chapter by chapter study on the life of Daniel, and comparing and contrast what happened in Daniel's life some during the 5th century BC to what's happening in 20th century or 21st century America. And I believe that there's a lot to learn from the life of Daniel, a lot to learn about specifically how to stand firm when everything around you is telling you that the smart thing to do, when everything around you is telling you that the expedient thing to do, when everything around you is telling you that the sensible thing to do, when everything around you is telling you to just do otherwise. And so, a little bit of background on the story, and if you haven't been following, it's a kind of fascinating story. I encourage you to go back to the first week of the series, which was about 5 weeks ago, and follow through on it, and it's just really an interesting story. But a little bit of background. You see, Daniel is a story of a Jewish boy who lived in Jerusalem until he was about 15 years old. And he was about 15 years old when Babylon, who was a superpower at the time, Babylon is modern day Iraq, when Babylon came in and conquered Jerusalem. And when they conquered Jerusalem, they not only kind of took all the stuff out of the temple, they took all the gold and silver, but they also took the smartest guys and the smartest people out of Jerusalem, and they took them back to the kingdom of Babylon. And the reason why they did that is that they wanted their knowledge, they wanted their brains, and they wanted to use them in areas of philosophy, in areas of engineering, and even as advisors to the king, because if you were smart, you could think about stuff. And so, as part of that process, they got Daniel. And Daniel and his 4 friends were four of those people who were really smart. But they said that in order to really serve as an advisor, they tried to get Daniel to really ignore his upbringing. And like, no, we don't want Daniel to think like a Jewish person. We want his brains, but we want him to think like an Iraqi, like a Babylonian. And so they try to get Daniel to forget his culture. They tried to get Daniel to kind of ignore his upbringing. And they kind of tried to get Daniel to ignore his God and to embrace the Babylonian culture. And it wasn't really all bad, because the Babylonian culture, embracing it, had a whole bunch of benefits. It had really, really good food. They had really good wine. They had really good parties. And so, they tried to get Daniel to do that. And Daniel stood firm. Daniel lived for a period, I think, of about 75 years in captivity. And he served under 4 kings. And he served under 2 empires, empire of Babylon, and then later on the Persia, which is modern-day Iran, conquered them. But during those 4 kings and those 2 empires, during that time, Daniel became known as a man of great integrity. Daniel became known as a man of great wisdom, and as a result, every king and every empire that was Daniel got promoted to a position of power. Even after he did things that people are like, well, that's not the smart thing to do. That's not the sensible thing to do. That's not the wise thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, and Daniel stood firm. And he got promoted. But Daniel also had another skill. Daniel had an incredible ability to interpret dreams. And if someone had a dream, if someone had a dream, Daniel could interpret it. But not only could he interpret dreams, right? But Daniel himself was an avid dreamer. And he was not only an avid night dreamer, like he'd sleep, he was also a good daydreamer. In other words, he would get visions. He would be like sitting down and he'd get a vision of something, and his dreams were so vivid. And so, the first 6 chapters of the book really talks about Daniel's history, like his history with the kings. But the last 6 chapters, chapters 7 through 12, are really all about the dreams and visions that Daniel had. And Daniel's dreams and his visions were not ordinary dreams like you and I would have, They were dreams about the future. They were dreams about things that had not yet happened. In other words, we would say that Daniel's dreams were prophetic. It was literally, his dreams and his visions were literally a future that God saw, a future that God gave him, was a vision of the future. And how we know that, in fact, 500 years later, Jesus in Matthew 24 validated that Daniel's dreams are real. But we also know from some other ways, before I get ahead of myself, let me just kind of back up. Before I get into the story, I want you to imagine, my wife, my sons always tease my wife, and she always says, pretend. Matthew, pretend that, Jonathan, pretend. So I want you to do a little pretend game today. I want you to kind of empty your mind, and I want you to imagine that you were living 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. You were born back in the 5th century BC, somewhere between then and the turn of between BC and AD. Imagine that, this is going to be hard, right? That you'd never seen electricity. You'd never seen planes. You'd never seen helicopters. You'd never seen TV. You'd never seen guns. You'd never seen pictures of atomic bombs. You've never seen radios. You've never seen a spaceship. You've never seen an automobile. You've never seen any of that before. And the reason why you'd never seen that, because at that time, none of that stuff was invented. As a matter of fact, there wasn't even words in the vocabulary that would for those things, because they weren't invented. Imagine then that you were living back then, and then a DeLorean shows up, like a Back to the Future car shows up, and you get in it, and they transport you to 2020 for a day. And in 2020, you saw everything that's in 2020, everything that we know. You saw the internet. You can't really see the internet. You saw the results of the internet. You saw all this stuff, and then they took you back to 2000 BC. And then they ask you to describe what is it that you saw. Well, with your 2,005-year-old vocabulary, there's no way you could describe what you saw in the 20th century. It was kind of like an impossible thing. And as you tried to describe it, imagine you trying to describe like a helicopter. You'd probably say something like, well, there's this giant locust. It's like this whole thing, and it had wings like thunder. Because that's really the only frame of reference you had to describe something like a helicopter. And the people around you would have no idea what you're talking about because you're like, I don't have any point of reference. And that right there is really what makes biblical prophecy a little difficult to understand, because people are writing about things that weren't invented yet without words that they had. And this permeates the Bible, from Daniel to Jesus to Paul to John. Throughout history, throughout the biblical history, God had given people a vision of the future. And today what I'm going to do is, and I encourage you to take notes today, right? Because this is going to be a little bit of a study, probably a little bit more deeper. For those of you guys like deep, today is going to be a little bit deeper, because I want you to have an orderly account of what's going to happen in the end time. And I'm going to summarize to you the visions that Daniel got, and how it ties in with the prophecies of Jesus, the prophecies of Paul, and then in the book of Revelation, the vision that the guy who wrote it, John, had, and how they all come together. So let's start here. Remember I said Daniel 7 through 12 is all about his dreams. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel said this. He's like, I was praying one day, and I was praying, and in the middle of my prayer, I had a vision. And a vision that an angel named Gabriel, and I'm going to digress a little bit here. Gabriel was an archangel, meaning he commanded 1/3 of heaven's armies. And he was a chief messenger angel. Whenever you get a message from God, it's normally a lot of times it's one of the messenger angels, and Gabriel is chief of that. But whenever Gabriel shows up in a dream or in a vision, you got to pay attention, because God was sending the number one guy, the top guy, the head guy over. So Daniel says he was praying, and in a vision, Gabriel shows up. And in Daniel 9:22, he says this. He says, Daniel, I've come here to give you insight and understanding. He said, Daniel, the moment that you began praying, a command was given. And now I'm here to tell you what it was. And I want you to know, Daniel, that you're very precious to God. So anyway, listen carefully so that you can understand the meaning of your vision. And then Gabriel says this, okay, Daniel, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to kind of summarize it for you. He says, a period of 70 sets of 7 has been decreed for your people and for your holy people and your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. And it was like, you guys are probably confused. I'm like, all right, let me break out. He says, Gabriel says to him, Daniel, here's what I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. In 70 7-year periods, right? So that's your 70 sets of 7. In your 70 7-year periods, I'm going to tell you what will happen during each of these 7 periods of time. And then Daniel describes what he saw would happen. And the most amazing thing is that it came through with incredible accuracy. For example, he said this in verse 25. And there's a little bit of math here, right? He said 7 sets of 7, that'd be 49, 7 sets of 7, plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until the ruler, who's the anointed one, comes. And after this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one will be killed. He'll be killed appearing to have accomplished nothing. We'll break that down for you. He said, Daniel said, 7 sets of 7, right, which is equal to 49. So he said, in exactly 49 years, the king of Persia is going to give a command allowing Jews to go back to Jerusalem and build it. That's the holy city that's mentioned there, right? To rebuild Jerusalem. So in 49 years, 7 sets of 7. And then in exactly by the way, exactly 49 years after that, Ezra, a guy named Ezra, got permission to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it. Exactly had Gabriel had told Daniel, and Daniel relayed it. And then he said, well, not only that, 62 sets of 7 years, or 7 times 62, 434 years later, a ruler who's called the Anointed One, which is the Messiah, is going to show up on the scene. Well, guess what? Jesus showed up on the scene within 434 years. And he shows up on the scene just like incredible accuracy. Daniel not only saw that, but he saw many other things, which I'll just tell you about because, it's all this math involved. Daniel saw Jesus' crucifixion. Daniel saw the Jewish temple being destroyed and built again and destroyed again. Daniel saw in those 70 sets of 7, he saw the fall of the Persian Empire. He not only saw the fall, and he said it, he saw the rise of the Greek Empire. He saw Alexander the Great. And all of this came through with incredible accuracy. Well, almost all of it. 69 of it came through except for the last period of 7 years. Remember, he said 70 sets of 7. And this period has not come through as yet. The last period of that 7 years is what Jesus talked about, the last period of 7. The last period of 7 is what Paul talked about. And the last period of 7 is really what John saw in his book in Revelation. Those last set of 7 years is what people describe as the end times. And the end of the world. The end of the world is going to be, well, of course, everything, when something has an end, there's something preceding. It talks about the 7 years preceding the end. The last 7 years, the last period of 7 describes how it all ends. And it's all yet to come, but I'm going to summarize what happens in the last period of 7. And I think a summary is actually good because the more you try to get into all the details, you're trying to take a 2,005-year-old vocabulary of what he wrote down, and you're trying to kind of figure out how it's going to work today, and sometimes it gets really hard. So I'm just going to summarize at a high level the things that Daniel saw that were going to come true, and what John saw that was going to come through, and what Jesus talked about that's going to come true, and what Paul talked about that was going to come true that hadn't happened yet. So get your pens ready. There are 10 significant events that are described in the last period, and the last period of 7 is in there. And this is about 800 years of Bible prophecy written by multiple people. Number 1, in Revelation, where John's vision is Revelation 2 and 3, it talks about the church age. And Jesus, by the way, we're living in the church age right now. The church age is a time when Jesus established the church, at the time when the end of the world. We're in the church age. And that's found in Revelation 2 and 3. And basically the symbolism there is that, because the church hadn't existed when Daniel wrote this down, or hadn't really been fully existed when John wrote it down. And Jesus says, I want my church, Jesus talking, to be focused on incredible church growth and incredible revival. And we're seeing that today, that the church is growing in the United States, America, and Europe. It's kind of stagnating, and in some places has dropped off a little, but in Asia and in Africa, the gospel is spreading like nothing the world has ever seen before. We look at COVID and we think about COVID and we think about all the bad things with COVID, but in our church in particular, as a result of COVID, our reach for people is between 2 and 4 times what we had when we were in person. In terms of the world, the number of people who have come to know Jesus, the number of people who have come to faith in Jesus since 2003 is greater, between 2003 and 2020, is greater than all the people throughout all of time who have come to know Jesus. I heard a pastor say that some time ago. And God messaged to the church, God messaged to us, God messaged to all the Christians like, hey, I'm doing some big things. I'm doing some big things, and so I want you to pay attention. I want you to get ready. I want you to get yourself in order because I'm doing some big things in this church age that we're living in. And at some point during the church age, we don't know when, because I remember I said we're living in the church age, the last 7 years begin. That's number one, the church age. The second major event is the rapture. At some point during the last 7 years, the church will be snapped away. The church is all the people who know Jesus personally, who have a personal relationship with Jesus. So imagine that you are, and this is my kind of imagination. Imagine that you're married to somebody who's not a believer in Jesus, and bam, all of a sudden you're talking to them and they disappear. They're gone. And they just flat out disappear from off the face of the earth. And so Jesus takes all the Christians out. That's the second event. The third event is the rise of the Antichrist. And the way I think about it is the rise of a great world leader. And he's a master negotiator who's going to bring peace. He's going to show up on the scene. He's going to be cool, suave. That's at least how I think about it. And he's going to bring peace to the world, a peace the world has never seen before. And then sometime after he brings peace, then something else begins. It says in the middle of the last 7 years, he's going to bring peace, and it gets to the period number 4, which is the worst period the world ever known. It's also known as the tribulation period. It's found in Revelation 11:2. And this period of time is going to be really difficult for people. It's going to start out with people having a really good life. And then when this world leader comes on the scene, the Bible calls him the Antichrist. And no one's really going to know. He's just going to seem like a regular dude. But then the last 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, is going to be like a living hell. The Antichrist is going to flip the script. And he's going to become a tyrant, especially for those people, because some people come to know Jesus after the original Christians are gone. And he's going to be a tyrant. And people will come to know Jesus, as I mentioned before, but it's going to be really, really difficult. And it's really going to be really hard to be a follower of Jesus, because the Antichrist, the world leader, is going to usher in an era of persecution. That's going to make it really difficult if you're a Christian. And this is the period of time where this world leader, this Antichrist, is going to make people take some kind of mark, some kind of identification. We don't know what it looks like, but the Bible, it's some kind of international ID, and in the Bible prophecy they say it's a number. It's 666, and so we don't really know exactly how that plays out, because again, it's 25-year-old vocabulary. But you can't really buy or sell anything without it, which brings us to the fifth event. At some time at the end of the tribulation period, Jesus comes back. We call it the second coming of Christ. It's in Revelation 16-19. And the imagery I want you to imagine here is that Jesus is sitting back. He's ready to come back. He's ready to come back. And he's ready to come back and take control of the earth. And he wants to come back, and he wants to kind of spend time with us. And somewhere along the way, and he wants to come back, and he wants to beat the devil in a final battle. And he comes back, and he defeats the devil. He defeats the Antichrist in a battle called Armageddon. And right after, it brings us to number 6. When he defeats, we go through all these periods of time, and after he defeats, the end of the 7 years, he defeats the Antichrist, and then there's something I call it the big party. The Bible calls it the marriage supper of the Lamb. Man, there'll be a party. There'll be a celebration. There'll be food. There's music. And by the way, unless you think that, there's going to be you're going to turn into some fat baby angel with wings and a halo, that's not going to happen. It's just going to be like regular people, just no devil around. And it's going to usher in the period number 7. It's called the millennial period. And there's going to be 1,000 years of Jesus reigning on earth as a king over all the earth, and there's no devil. There's no Satan. There's none of that. There's no temptation. And so if you like earth, guess what? You'll be living back here for 1,000 years, which brings us to period number 8. It's called the last rebellion. Because at the end of 1,000 years, for some unknown reason, Jesus lets Satan back in. Let Satan back to the earth. he loosened Satan out of his bondage that he put him in during the Battle of Armageddon. And I don't know why some Bible scholars think that maybe Jesus wanted to see if people had a choice, if they would choose him again, if the devil was tempting them. And then Jesus binds him up. And he throws him into a lake of fire. Which brings us to period number 9, something called the Great White Throne Judgment. The Bible says that everybody who is dead, who died, and everybody who is living, if you didn't accept Jesus, you'll have your day to say why you didn't accept him and didn't accept his invitation. Now, this answers the question, people like, what about those people who have never heard? What about those people who have never heard? Is God just going to, let them go to hell? No, I believe that God is going to judge you in the great white throne judgment according to what he reveals to you. For those who have accepted Jesus, you don't have to go through that. Your name is written in a book. God's right down. Yep, he's one of mine. Yep, he's one of mine. Yep, she's one of mine. But for the people who haven't, they're going to be in the great white throne judgment, and they'll get to plead their case as to why God should let them in. And then period number 10 is the rest of eternity. God is going to recreate a new heaven and a new earth. And there really is going to be no devil. It's going to be like the original Garden of Eden, what God existed, except there'll be no serpent running around the place. And I kind of love that, It's going to be a real city. It's going to be real communities, real town. There's going to be all ethnic groups, and everybody going to be together without any sin. And what I just gave you there is a whole bunch of Bible prophecy summarized in 10 steps. Anybody ask you? So back to Daniel. Here's how Daniel summed it up in Daniel chapter 12. He's like, at that time, Michael, the archangel, I remember I mentioned Gabriel before. Well, Michael is another archangel. Michael is over 1/3 of heaven's angels, and they're the warriors. They're the ones who are the guardian angels. They're the one who protects you. They're the one who fights spiritual warfare on behalf of you. Archangel who stands guard over your nation will arise. And then there'll be a time of anguish greater than any since the nations first came into existence. But at a time, every one of your people whose name is written in the book will be rescued. Remember I just talked about it, right? It's a tribulation period when all the Christians disappear. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. And at the end, when everybody's name is, all the Christians whose name is written in the Lamb's book of life will be rescued. Yeah, that's what he's talking about. In Daniel 12:2, he said, and many of those whose body lie dead and buried will rise up, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. What he's saying there is that's the great white throne judgment that I just talked about. And then I like verse 3. He said, and those who are wise will shine as bright as the sky. And those who lead many to righteousness will shine like stars forever. But you, Daniel, keep these prophecies a secret. Seal them up until the time of the end. You know the time of the end when many will rush here and there and knowledge will increase. Basically, Michael told Daniel, he says, at the time of the end, Daniel, you know how you'll know the time of the end? Is that people rush here and there. And that's a reference to the fact that people can get to places really quickly. Back 2,500 years ago, to go 50 miles, you couldn't go more than 50 miles in a day. And that's a good day. Now you could go to China in a day from here. So people rush here and there. And then he said also, and knowledge will increase, right? He says knowledge will increase. Do you know that prior to 200 years ago, that technology doubled like every 200 years? Knowledge, which is what technology is. 50 years ago, knowledge was doubling every 20 years. Knowledge is now doubling every 12 to 18 months. Technology doubles every 12 to 18 months. So I gave you all of this. What's the point of all of this? Why did I even go through all of this and give you all of this? Like what's our takeaway? There are three takeaways that I believe that God would have us take away from the last 6 chapters of Daniel. The first one is be wise. Be wise. You see, the devil knows biblical prophecy also. He knows that God says he loses in the end. And so he has really two goals. One, to try and prove God wrong. Because you see, Satan really believes that he can take God out. He can win God. He tried it many, many years ago when God kicked him out of heaven. And he still believes that he can take God out. He's like, despite the prophecy. He knows a long shot, but he believes he can take God out. And number two, so he has two goals. One is he's going to prove God wrong. And number two is he knows, the devil knows, Satan knows that once you have invited Jesus into your life, he can't win you back. But he can try to make you lose your ability to lead others to Jesus. And that's what he tries to do. He's like, all right, I can't win them back, but I can prevent them from leading somebody else to Jesus. And one of the primary ways he does that is to use culture, which we've been talking about in this entire book. Culture to break down your defenses. Uses culture to influence you and to desensitize you into what's right and what's wrong. You want to know what I'm talking about? A prime example of that is, let's say premarital sex. Well, I'll just say sex outside the context of marriage. You watch any movie, any TV show, talk to your friends, go on social media, anywhere. There's nothing in our culture that says sex outside of the context of marriage is wrong. Because the devil has been systematically breaking down our defenses. So be wise. You got to get involved in like a Bible study or a small group. Have an accountability partner. Get involved in church. And, during these election times, culture is tugging at us to take some really dogmatic approaches. Because they know that, the devil knows that when we take these dogmatic approaches around political parties which come and go, it knows that we'll end up block, mute, unfollow, unfriend people. That we'll give up friendships and we'll stop talking to people that we have influence over. All because they don't subscribe to the same political platform, or they don't like our candidates that we do. But be wise, because it's a trick of the enemy who wants nothing more than to divide us. Because he knows that when we are divided, he wins. And so even though he knows the prophecy that he loses in the end, he wins every time our actions turns somebody off from following God. Every time our actions result in us losing our influence over somebody, and somebody decides not to follow Jesus because of our actions, he wins. And I tell you all the time, man, the devil is smart. He's been at this thing for a while, and so in order for us to stand up and be wise, we got to put on the whole armor of God so that we can defeat, the devil has some schemes, and in case, we wonder the whole armors of God, it's found in Ephesians 6:10, where Paul says, hey, guys, be strong. Be strong in the Lord and his mighty power. How you be strong? You put on the whole armor so you can stand up against the devil's schemes. You need to understand that what's going on in the election, what's going on with dogmatic approaches, what's going on in media is not like flesh and blood. You're not fighting against flesh and blood, but you're fighting against these things, these rulers, and against authorities and things, against power in the dark world, and against spiritual forces in outside of our ability to see. So you put on the whole armor, so that when the day comes, when you're getting tempted and getting influenced, you're able to stand. And after you stand, you've done everything to stand. And so here's the whole armor then. Stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness, and with your feet fitted with readiness that comes from the message of peace, which is, he's saying, hey, make sure you know the truth. Make sure that you act with righteousness. Make sure you act right. And make sure that you pursue peace. And he's like, well, those are defensive weapons, but let me give you some offensive weapons. But I want you to take up a shield. I want you to be characterized by faith, because your faith is going to be able to extinguish the darts of the evil one. And I want you to get saved. I want you to come to know Jesus. And I want you to use the sword of the Spirit, which is the Bible, which is the Word of God. And he says, hey, above all of that, I want you to pray. We should, if you want to stand up against the wiles and the schemes of the devil, prayer has got to be like a regular part of your thing. It's got to be not only a go-to in the morning and evening. Prayer is that thing. And keep on praying. Verse 18. For all the Lord's people. First takeaway is be wise. Number 2 is be active. See, God is holding back and returning until the whole world hears. And we're commissioned from God to share the good news of Jesus. And I realize the world is this politically correct world, and this cancel culture that people talk about, it can seem extremely hard to do that. But there's an imperative that we must. And why? Well, because that is what love requires from us. That's what love requires us to do. We're not sharing because, I'm not sharing my faith here. I'm not standing up here because I have some ulterior motive. Actually, it's what love requires me to do. I want you to imagine for a second that, somebody that you genuinely, love, right? Your father, your brother, your mother, sister, cousin, friend, co-worker. If you saw them doing something that was going to end in their death, and you knew it was going to end in their death, you wouldn't just keep quiet. You would tell them with urgency. If you saw them getting into a car that you knew had no brakes, you would run over to them and tell them, don't get in the car, don't drive that car. You tell them with some urgency, and because that's what love requires you to do. Because if you didn't do that, that's not love. Now here's the fact that not only are our days on earth numbered, but the days of earth are numbered. Our days on earth are numbered, but the days of earth is numbered. And every single day that we wake up, it's one less day in the number of the rest of our lives, and one less day in the number of days of this earth. So be active. And be like it says, Daniel said in Daniel's 12:3 rather. Those who are wise will shine as bright as the sky, so be wise. And those who lead many to righteousness, be active, will shine like stars forever. As I wrap this message up and wrap up this whole series of talks on Daniel, I realize today topic may seem like a little bit much. I realize that today's message is kind of deep and heavy, and the parts of it may be a little bit confusing. I realize that it may be leaving you with tons of questions. And the thing is that if this is you, I just want you to know that you are in good company. You're in really good company. See, Daniel himself had this vision, and in his vision, he too had the exact same feeling. He said this in Daniel 12:8. He said, I heard what he said, but I did not understand what he meant. He's talking about the angel. And because he didn't understand, just like cut to the chase. My wife does all the time. I'm telling her a long story. She's like, can you just tell me the end? So Daniel asks, how will all of this end, my Lord? Verse 9, but he said, go now, Daniel, for what I've said to you is kept a secret, unsealed until the end. God's message to Daniel was really his message to us. He's like, I'm not going to tell you exactly when all this is going to happen. But I'm just going to show you the signs. I'm going to tell you the signs because I want you to be ready. And that's the last takeaway from this message, is to be ready. To be wise, to be active, and to be ready. But even more important that we got to be ready. And this is the final step. And Jesus himself said in Matthew 24, he said, you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day your Lord is coming. Understand this. If a homeowner knew when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into. You must also be ready at the time, for the Son of Man will come when least expected. The fact of the matter is, one day this world as we know it will come to an end. And we don't know when. But Jesus is coming back. And only those who know him personally will be with him. And those who don't will go to a place that that God did not and does not want you to go to. It's a place that's reserved for the devil and his angels, and his demons. And you may think, well, that's not going to happen. It's all metaphors and all this other stuff. And I'll just say this. Being with Jesus forever is good. Being without Jesus forever is not good. Or said differently, being with the devil and his demons forever is really, really bad. And I'll say this also. If all of Daniel's interpretation of his dreams, 69 out of 70 years, periods of 7, came true with incredible accuracy, which is a fact. History says that's a fact. I say it's a pretty good bet that the last period of 7 is going to come true with that same level of accuracy. Especially if Jesus also talked about it, which is also a fact. So whether you believe it or not, it doesn't make it any less a fact, right? Just be ready. And how do you do that? It's simply by asking Jesus to come and take charge of your life. And by you asking, and you making a commitment, rather, to be a follower of him, to follow his examples, to be a follower of his teachings, and to be a follower of his path. And as we close out, I'm inviting you to do that right now. If you want to do that, just say this prayer with me. Heavenly Father, I pray that, Lord, that you'll just forgive me of all my sins. Lord, I know that I've messed up over and over and over and over again. I've not lived the life. I've not been wise in my decision. I certainly have not been active. And I know I'm not ready. So Lord, come into my life and take control. And I commit to live my life for you in Jesus' name. Amen. If you've done that, guess what? Your name is written in the book of life. And you're going to be with Jesus forever. And that is a better life in eternity. But he also gives you a better life here on this earth. God bless you. Have a wonderful Sunday. See you next week.